very thing that's keeping you alive is the thing that ultimately is going to end up killing you. This is the great irony. The mechanisms that have brought us to this extraordinary place have built into them its own demise. And it's just an incredible paradox. It's an amazing dilemma. Gee, wouldn't it be interesting to try to understand aging, and in particular from a physicist's viewpoint, not just aging and why we die, but what sets the scale of life? That is, why is it that, even if you're very healthy, you're going to die of the order of 100 years, and not 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years? And why is it that we don't only live for 2 to 3 years like a mouse? So where does all this come from? And that I started to think about, just as as a hobby to begin with. But very quickly, as I started to learn stuff, I became more and more interested and more excited about it. And to cut a very long story short, very gradually, that led me to do some work in it, to become associated with the Santa Fe Institute, eventually moved to the Santa Fe Institute, work with biologists, and develop a whole framework that was in answer to that question, but actually spread to everything from, not just aging and mortality, but of course the more fundamental question, what's keeping us alive, metabolism, and all the other questions about life. And so that's what I've spent the last 15 years or so doing. And as I mentioned at the opening, what it has led me to also is the whole question about whether this fantastic socioeconomic system that we've evolved, beginning particularly with the Industrial Revolution, entrepreneurship, capitalism, free markets, and so on, which has been so successful, has built into it its own inevitable collapse. And that's what I work on. It's one of the many things I work on now. The percentage change in whatever it is that you measure is simply proportional to the percentage change in the size. So, to be slightly more specific, roughly speaking, if you double the size of an organism from, say, 2 grams to 4 grams, or 2 kilograms to 4 kilograms, or whatever, doesn't matter where you begin, instead of doubling the amount of energy that is needed, even though you have twice as many cells to support, you actually only need 75% more, about 3/4 more. So there's a 25% savings, roughly, with each doubling of size. And that kind of systematic behavior is kind of amazing. And it was true across, all taxonomic groups of organisms, whether you looked at mammals, birds, fish, crustacea, insects, and so forth. So that was surprising to me. But then I learned that it wasn't just true of metabolic rate. It was true of everything, essentially. I mean, almost anything that could be measured about an organism, anything that's kind of physiological, so something mundane like, the length of the aorta, the first tube that comes out of your heart, or something sophisticated like lifespan, or growth rate, time to maturity, or, diffusion rates of oxygen across membranes, whatever, it doesn't matter. But when these quantities are plotted in this way, they all have this similar power law behavior, and whatever this savings is always some simple multiple of 25% of a quarter. The number 1/4 dominated biology, and that is called quarter power scaling, in fact. So I became very intrigued about that, and I realized that to understand aging, which was the thing, and death, the thing I was interested in, I have to understand where the hell these laws come from, and then we can apply it to mortality. The first thing you ask yourself is, look, how can it be that the same scaling laws apply to the plants and trees outside of the window here as applied to my body? You know, we're quite different. Or to fish, and so on. Why? How come all these different, all have exactly the same laws in terms of how they scale? Obviously, something is very systematic and common to all of them. And you ask yourself, what is common? And then you realize very quickly, the thing that's common is the challenge of how you support the enormous numbers of cells of which we're made. We have 100 trillion, 10 to the 14th cells, and they have to be sustained in a very kind of, roughly speaking, democratic and efficient way. And, you know, we all know how natural selection has done it. It's evolved a bunch of networks, circulatory systems and respiratory systems and renal systems and neural systems and so on, all of which deliver energy, resources, and information to local sites, usually cells. And of course, by the way, jumping ahead, this idea, of course, has a very obvious analog in a social organization. Whether it's a city or a company, you have to have these networks. Of course, everybody needs to be connected and so forth. So we'll come to that in a minute. So the idea was, it is the properties, the universal properties, mathematical and physical properties of these networks that is being expressed by these scaling laws, even though the physical manifestation of these networks are quite different. I mean, the tree and our network, quite different in their engineered structure, but the scaling laws are the same. But the point is, they're trying to do the same thing. They're trying to support all the cells and so on. Many of our systems are approximately optimized so that the circulatory system all of us share, all of us, meaning every single mammal that has ever existed, that all of us share or have shared, is one that minimizes the amount of work our hearts have to do to pump blood through the system and deliver to the cells oxygen and other nutrients. That's the idea, so that you minimize that. So in a certain sense, you minimize the mundane challenge of being alive and being active. You minimize that amount of energy so that you can maximize the amount of energy you devote to Darwinian fitness, meaning to reproduction, sex, and rearing of children, and so on. So that's the idea. Those are the successful organisms are those that have roughly optimized the network. Well, you know, physics has, you know, all of the laws of fundamental physics actually are, you know, even, you know, theory of relativity, quantum mechanics, etc., are all derivable from those kinds of principles, those kinds of optimization principles, something physicists call the principle of least action. In social systems, socioeconomic systems, almost nothing had been done in asking about, do cities scale, do companies scale, and so forth. So the first part of this work was a mammoth effort of getting hold of data by my young colleagues, may I say, not me, who did the hard work, to gather data and ask, do these social entities scale? The idea was the most important thing was companies. We were going to really see if we could use the same way of doing biology on companies so that we would see if they scale and then try to understand quantitatively, analytically, their life histories and structure. One of the things that we discovered was that the cities do indeed scale. That in fact, despite appearances, you know, New York is a scaled up Los Angeles, which is a scaled up Cleveland or Santa Fe, even though their histories and geographies and cultures are different, that they're, you know, to 80–90% level. They're scaled versions of one another, much like, despite appearances, a whale is a scaled up giraffe, which is a scaled up mouse. I mean, but in terms of actually what you measure about them, anything you measure, that's what they are, and they're explained by this network geometry and dynamics. So we discovered this about cities, but their scaling was a little more sophisticated, it turned out, than animals and plants. Because what we discovered was, in terms of the infrastructure of cities, the roads and electrical lines and gas lines and so on, they did scale like biology, in the sense that the bigger they were, the less infrastructure they needed per capita. In biology, the bigger you are, the less energy, for example, you need by about 25%, the bigger you are. Every time you double here, instead of 25%, it was 15%. You need 15% less infrastructure. And it turned out, when we looked at across all kinds of infrastructure that we could lay our hands on, and across data and data from across the globe, China, Japan, Colombia, Chile, Portugal, Germany, so on, they all looked the same. It always was the same, pretty much. So that was like biology, but except for the 15% rather than 25%. But, and here was the new thing and the most exciting thing, was that in terms of socioeconomic quantities, so quantities that involve the interaction between human beings, which do not exist in biology, such as wages, the production of patents, the number of AIDS cases, the amount of crime, and so on. All of these things scale in a different way. They scale in a fashion we termed superlinear, meaning that instead of the bigger you are, the less per capita, in all these cases, the bigger you are, the more per capita. And the more per capita was by about 15%. So every time you double a city, instead of having twice as many patents produced, so twice the innovation, you get an added 15%. So the bigger the city, the more socioeconomic activity, the more creative it is, the higher the wages, the more opportunity, but also the more crime and disease and so forth. So all of these things come along together as a package. And so that was very nice, and it was quite universal, in quotes, meaning it seemed to be the same in all of the countries where we could get data. And then the question arises, as it did in biology, when the hell do these things come from? How come Japanese and American cities scale in the same way, or Portuguese cities? It wasn't as if there was a Congress in 1720 when everybody sat down and said, this is how we're going to design our cities. So even though they look different, they're going to obey these rules. Quite the contrary, they evolved organically as organisms did. The question is, what is behind those laws? Well, the thing that you realize very quickly, if you ask how, what's common among Japanese, Chilean, American, and Dutch cities, you realize, of course, the great commonality is they're people. I mean, people built them, and the whole point of a city is to facilitate social interaction. So the idea is that these scaling laws are a reflection of the generic behavior of social networks across the globe. So even though cultures may be different, and the way we express things, the way, in fact, we interact with each other in terms of the network, the structure of the network is not so different wherever you are, whatever it is. And that's sort of obvious, that's because we're all human beings with the same DNA, basically, and so forth. So that was the idea, and the idea is it is the structure of that network. Now, it has one other major constraint about this network. So first of all, one of the characteristics of this network, which is very different than biology, is that it has positive feedback in it. I talk to you, you talk to someone else, they talk to someone else. then he talks to me, and we meet and we talk. And out of that conversation, whatever it is, whatever it's about, we build something. Positive feedback. Continually building. And of course, that's the origin of ideas, new ways of thinking, innovation, and the origin of wealth creation. So all of this, that's what our institutions do, and that's what cities are for. Maybe, as I think was Ed Glaser, the urbanist at Harvard, said, maybe our greatest invention. And I tend to agree with him. I think it's an amazing machine we invented to do this, and it's been unbelievably successful because they continue to grow, and all the wealth and ideas are created by cities, basically. When you think of social networks, you sort of think in a kind of virtual hyperspace. You draw these diagrams where each one of us is a node and each person is connected, and you imagine we're connecting by, cell phones or on the web or whatever. Great, that's true. However, the thing that we forget is that it doesn't matter who you are and who you're connecting to, you have to be somewhere. I mean, place plays a role. You have to be in this room. You have to be in your kitchen. You might even be on the toilet. I don't know, but you have to be somewhere. Not only that, you have to be moving between places. You have to go from one place to another, and you have to be sustained. And what does that mean? That the moving and sustenance comes from the infrastructural networks. So you can't have the social network without the infrastructural network, and they're wedded together. They are integrated, even though one has an economy of scale, the infrastructure, by 15%, and the other one has increasing returns to scale by 15%. And it turns out when you wed these together, when you ensure that everybody has to be in a place and that the infrastructural networks are space-filling, meaning every person has to be served by the network, you can show that the 15% that you save from infrastructure is reflected in the 15% that you gain in innovation and wealth and more disease and so on. In organisms, well, in any of these systems, what happens? Energy and resources come in, that's metabolism. It gets put into a form that can be used and then sent through networks to support the individual constituents, cells or people, whatever. So, but what does it do for those constituents? Well, it maintains those that are there, repairs damage, and replaces ones that have died, whether they're, again, cells or people. But it also grows new ones, new cells, new people, and so forth. So if you put that into mathematics, that statement that I made, then it turns out that you can explain the structure of the growth of organisms, why it is that we grow very quickly at the beginning, and then we stop growing. And the cessation of growth is driven or intimately related to the economy of scale, the sublinear behavior, there's 3/4 being less than 1 of the scaling of metabolism. That ensures that you stop growing. Now, let's take that idea and go to social system, to a city in particular. You have the same conceptual equation. Metabolism goes to maintenance and new growth. But when you do that, what you discover is instead of the bigger you are, the less supply per capita to something that needs to be maintained so that it eventually stops. Now, the supply always outpaces the need for maintenance because of superlinearity, because of this added 15%. So you're getting further and further ahead of what you need just to maintain. That means that you have open-ended growth. Just keep going. And so this drive to get new things, continually getting new things, to continually replacing, things that are perfectly fine. Often people get rid of their car after 2 or 3 years, doing just fine. Or, you exchange your iPhone 5 for an iPhone 6, and this year you're going to replace it by an iPhone 7 with probably decreasing ability, relatively speaking. Biology, the economy of scale and the sublinear behavior turns out mathematically implies that the pace of life slows down the bigger you are. So that the bigger organism, everything moves slower. Times are slower, it lives much longer, and so forth. So if you scaled all those times of an elephant down, it would be a mouse. That's all it is. A scaled down mouse is a scaled down elephant from this viewpoint. But times, so you have this image of the sort of very slow, plodding elephant versus the scurrying mouse. Turns out when you look at the same mathematical structure in social systems in cities in particular, the superlinear part, which is derived from the positive feedback between people, leads to the speeding up of time in a systematic, by the way, in both cases in a systematic, predictable way. So time speeds up, the bigger you are, the faster everything is. So everything in a big city, New York, is a much faster city in almost everything that you can measure about it than, Santa Fe, which is where we are at the moment. It was a very small town. And we all viscerally feel that, but in fact the data supports that. People even walk faster in bigger cities. And all in a quantitative way predictable. There's this whole phenomenon of not just, needing more, wanting more, but all of that related to this continuous positive feedback leading to everything speeding up, wanting more faster. So it's the combination of both, and all understood within this sort of fundamental social network theoretical framework. So, from a scientific point of view, this is great because it's a very nice parsimonious theory for understanding these phenomena, and it's very much a big picture one. But it has all kinds of remarkable implications, which at some level might be a bit speculative, but they do follow if you just follow through the mathematics. The first is that it's very nice that instead of this bounded growth behavior in biology, you grow and stop, like we've done, and then we die, by the way, which is also part of the theory. This one is that you have open-ended. Fantastic. That's what we see. The data agrees with that. However, it has built into it a kind of fatal flaw, and that goes by the name mathematically of a finite time singularity. That's the mathematical term for what's in the mathematics. So what does that mean in English? That means that in some finite time in the future, it could be 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, but in some finite time, whatever the metric is you're looking at, could be the GDP, could be the number of AIDS cases, whatever, is going to become infinite, which is completely crazy. That's nuts. And the theory tells you what happens, that before then, that if you would try to continue, the system will stagnate and then collapse. So it's a kind of sophisticated version of Malthus. Malthus says, you're going to become infinite in an infinite time. And in that sense, maybe it's not such a big deal. There's not such a, there's not infinite time. So maybe we can get by. This doesn't say that at all. This says in some finite time, we're going to be in trouble. And that time may be quite soon. So the question is, how do you avoid that? And this also goes to this question of continuously wanting more. The the way to avoid it, and the way we have avoided it, is to reset the clock of this curve, so it's the rise of this curve of growth, by making a major innovation, a paradigm shift, which we've done many times, whether it be something from a long time ago, like the discovery of bronze or iron, or something much more recent, like the discovery of coal, or very recent, the discovery or the invention of computers, and very recently, the invention or discovery of IT. And each one of these, so to speak, resets the clock so you can start over again. You know, so that you can avoid the pitfall of collapse. As you go up any growth curve, life is getting faster. So life is getting faster and faster. And then at some stage, you have to make a shift. And then you go even faster. And then you have to make another shift. The rate at which you shift gets faster and faster, meaning that you have to innovate at a faster and faster rate, so that something that might have taken 100 years to evolve 1,000 years ago now only takes 20 years, and soon will only take 15 and then 10. You can imagine, you can make it sort of reductio ad absurdum, and you ask yourself, is that conceivable? So the image that I sometimes like to give is that, you know, you're on a treadmill, and the treadmill is accelerating. It's going faster and faster, and you're running to keep up. But then, at some stage, there's another treadmill next to it, and part of this exercise is you have to jump onto that other treadmill, which is going even faster. And then, at some stage, quite soon, you have to jump to another one that's going even faster than that, and you have to do this faster and faster. So it's almost like a double exponential. And the question is, can we, as a socioeconomic society, continue to do this without a heart attack and die, you know, so to speak? That's the question. And can we really understand this? And what could we do to intervene to stop it? Because the canonical economic response, originally to Malthus, and then to all the people that have followed him, you know, the Club of Rome and the population bomb and all these other things, which have given dire predictions, which are all wrong, by the way, is because the economic response has been, they don't realize we innovate ourselves out of this. Every time, you know, that's what we do. That's what being a human is. We innovate, and so don't worry about it. Look at us. We're producing all that. We continually innovate. Well, my response to that is yes, but all that innovation is doing is postponing. It's not solving, and you have to postpone faster and faster, and that is not conceivable. So that's the dilemma for me, and I think about that. And part of the looniness that many of us feel about the acceleration of the pace of life, both in terms of just our daily lives, but also in terms of, you know, I'm going to have to, at some stage, probably get an iPhone 7, and I'm going to get a new computer next week. Who needs it? But I need, you know, I have to do it. I have to do all this. You have to keep up with all this stuff. I had to learn how to do, last year, I'm a man of 76 years old. I had to learn how to do Uber. And in fact, I had to learn to do Uber, and then a few months later, it was marvelous that I did, because Uber put the taxi company out of business in Santa Fe. So had I not learned Uber, I couldn't use a taxi. I couldn't use that kind of transportation in Santa Fe. So, and the world's moving that way. So these things are happening, and they're happening faster and faster.
So instead of jumping from one treadmill to the next, we need no treadmill.
Or no treadmill, exactly. If we could, that would, or that treadmill is something into another space, which is a more socio-cultural space rather than technological, material, physical space. Maybe. I don't know. I don't even know what words to describe it. but not to have a treadmill. But the question then is, then the question that it begs is the one that I said a few moments ago. Without a treadmill, whether it's accelerating or not, can we in fact survive? You know, what is it that's driving us and so on? Because, you know, we haven't lived in harmony with the biosphere for, you know, over 10,000 years, which, by the way, is nothing, of course, needless to say, is a blip. And one of the questions I sometimes ask is, you know, is this some diabolical experiment in natural selection that was just destined to last about 10,000 years, of which we were very fortunate to be part of, but in fact is going to disappear, and, you know, some other experiment will be done, you know, maybe presumably with human beings again. I mean, human beings will, well, unless we have some horrific nuclear war, I suppose, but human beings will survive and we'll try some other route, or maybe we're destined to go on doing this. I don't know. As we get faster and faster, it creates greater and greater anxiety and greater and greater dissociation, I would say, among many people. It's produced fantastic things for us. I mean, this is our dilemma. It's phenomenal. I mean, let's face it, email's wonderful. My iPhone is great. Google Maps, marvelous. All these things are great, but they're driving us nuts. And the question is there any way we can limit any of this? Can we have our cake and eat it too? And I have become quite pessimistic that, until recently, by the way. At first, when I thought of that, I thought, my God, you know, amazingly, we have serendipitously, by accident, stumbled across the solution. Somehow, IT is going to get us out of this. And then I gave it more thought, and I realized, no, actually, all IT does is another one of these jumps. And all it's done is speeded everything up yet again. And I started reading quite a bit about the 19th century literature, because many of us don't appreciate that the invention of the steam engine and the invention of the telephone probably had much greater impact on the globe than IT, because up until the steam engine and the democratization of travel, the vast majority of people stayed and lived within 10 to 20 miles of where they were born. That was it. You know, and suddenly, well, not suddenly, it took a while, they could go from, you know, New York to Chicago in this country, or from, you know, London to Sheffield, or whatever, you know, and get, so this is a huge, I mean, this never happened. This was, and then somewhere towards the end of the 19th century, we invented the telephone. So instead of having to wait days, and in many cases, some cases months for a communication, before long, you could do it instantaneously. You could do it just as fast as sending an email message. Speed of light controls that. There's no, you know, and so, you know, this was incredibly profound. I mean, that was amazing. The telephone was extraordinary, what it did. And, you know, and in fact, of course, maybe we can communicate better on the telephone than we can with these bloody emails and tweets and all the rest, which are so compressed and so tend to be impersonal. Well, that's a whole nother issue in terms of its psychosocial implications. But anyway, this turned me around to realizing that no, this is only quantitative, this change, not qualitative. We can get out of this, but the real issue is that we don't have either the social or political will to do so. We don't have the consciousness that hasn't been raised high enough, I don't know what, to do this. And a great example is, of course, the difficulties with trying to get the ideas about global warming across, which is one manifestation of this. But such things, but many of the other things about our lives, which are sort of lives out of control, we don't, it's very hard for us to appreciate. We're all on the same treadmill. And what we really need is social and political leadership that starts to make a change. And as I say, I was quite negative because I feel there isn't any. And secondly, if you believe this work, it's sort of embedded in the structure of social networks. So how, that needs to change. Something needs to change at a more fundamental level. So I was quite negative, hoping I'm wrong. Now I want to go back to what I said earlier about these paradigm shifts and innovations. I certainly, and almost all the literature talks about them the way I did, technologically. Some invention, the telephone, the steam engine, the computer, discovery of coal, it's all very physical and so on. So what I began to dawn on me is, of course, at some stage in the next, short period of time, 20, 50 years, we need one of these paradigm shifts, maybe the most important, to be something that isn't actually technological or physical, it's cultural and social. We need a cultural, social change in the way we interact with each other, the kinds of social networks we're involved in, and the way we think about these things. And I certainly, many people have said things along those lines, I presume, and I certainly have thought of this, but have just dismissed it as impossible. In the past, I've always assumed that these changes take decades for things to shift, but maybe not. Maybe not, because maybe the potentiality exists in the kind of, the Weltanschauung of the culture. I don't know, that it's actually sitting there. Anyway, these are kind of funny thoughts that I've been having these last several weeks. And associated with them are things that other people have thought about, is that, that would also lead to, instead of always defining our success in terms of physical and economic terms, the GDP or the stock market, which of course we would want to do, there needs to be other metrics that are just as important. I hate to even broach it, but happiness or quality of life index or something that, we pay attention to, that means as much to us as, I've got money in the stock market and it went down or it went up, or the GDP of this city isn't as good as it should be or is much better. But we also have this other thing that goes along with it, and we think in those terms. And I guess the fundamental question is, can we redefine growth that way? And hopefully keep growing in that way? Or is it conceivable to not have growth, or at least the traditional growth, and still have a vibrant, innovative, wealth-producing, exciting society without growth? Is that conceivable? Or is it that we need we need that, which is going to lead to our destruction? So that's the dilemma I find myself in and have been grappling with the last 2 to 3 years and think about.
How does artificial intelligence come into this debate?
Well, AI and machine learning and things like it are, of course, part of this progression. And I think they're, and big data, there's this ability to collect enormous amounts of data. And some of my work is involved dealing with these enormous data sets. Some of our works in trying to understand in testing the theories about cities has involved using cell phone data, using cell phones as a detector of human interaction, social interaction, and movement. I mean, it's extraordinary. So it's almost like we're tagged every molecule in this room. It's amazing. So billions and billions of these phone calls need to be analyzed, and we've done that kind of work. And that's fantastic, you know. So, you know, on the one hand, these techniques are very powerful and extremely useful. But one of the serious problems with them is that there's a certain mechanical nature to them, which a sort of algorithmic nature, which has lulled people into this kind of false state of mind that these are somehow going to brilliantly expose the truth, and this is the way things are. And in particular, it sort of is derivative of this idea that if it's spewed out by a computer, it must be right, you know, that kind of image. So there's this, I don't know, aura about that to begin with. It's coupled with the IT revolution, you know, ideas that are of data, especially promoted by Google, just simply as a search engine. It's fantastic. So all of those kinds of things. So as a package, it's very seductive. But the problem is that it would be dangerous, stupid, and highly counterproductive to think that that's going to supplant science, the traditional scientific methodology, observation, experiment, data, phenomenological theories or phenomenological models leading to conceptual theories, mathematizable, and so on, which are predictive and which are general. And it's the great power of much of science, is that it's general. If you write down, I could write on this board here in a corner, Newton's laws of motion and Newton's law of gravitation. And implicit in that is almost everything around us. So that contains an infinite amount of data. And that is amazing, you know, that it's so compressed and parsimonious and conceptually so phenomenal. And that's been the power. And where all this has come from. Wouldn't have any of this. You know, you wouldn't have, you know, Maxwell's equations, being able to put them into a mathematical language, which explains all of electricity and magnetism at that time. And then the human mind realizing for that equations to be consistent predicts electromagnetic waves, that light is an electromagnetic wave and that we can transmit electromagnetic waves. My God, you wouldn't have, I mean, that was so revolutionary and it's had such an impact on us. Certainly wouldn't have IT, that's for sure. So that is extraordinary. So we need to keep that. So I am a big fan, frankly, of all of these techniques. I'm fine with them. I'm not a fan of people that raise it to the level at which it is the dominant mode in which we do science. And I'm afraid that is beginning to happen more and more, especially in sort of the greater culture of Silicon Valley. That's being promoted. Many companies are buying into it and so forth, as if this is the panacea for everything, you know, leading to promises of smart health and smart cities and smart delivery systems and smart this and smart that, all of which will be very useful, but are going to be fraught with unintended consequences. Why? Because we haven't developed a framework, a conceptual framework for understanding how they all interact and what their dynamic is and so on. So, you know, I'm very fearful of those things because of that, because there isn't enough time and energy being devoted to thinking more systemically and holistically about the implications of these things. And so we need this, just to recap, we need the integration of these techniques from big data, AI, machine learning, and so on, integration of that with the traditional scientific methodology. So in addition to artificial intelligence, we need human intelligence to be an integral part of it. And as part of that, we need to develop a deeper understanding of the dynamics and organization of complex adaptive systems in general to minimize and mitigate against the potential of very dangerous unintended consequences.
In making this film, I spoke with a lot of academics, futurists, investors, and there was often a point where the conversation turned towards the meaning of life.
Yes, absolutely. What is the meaning of life? Yes. No, it's exactly right. What is it? What are we doing? What's the point? What's the point in having, I mean, I often say when I've talked about this, I'm a total hypocrite. I live in a huge house. My children have left. I still live in a huge house. And I have 3 cars. My wife has one. I have one. And then I have this silly old 1953 Singer sports car, which doesn't really... But anyway, I have them. Why should I have... Well, it's kind of crazy. On top of all the other things I have, which are unnecessary, kind of thing, and it's sort of a platitude. Does any of this make me happier? Is the point of life to be happy, to fulfill, to be contented, to produce, to love? But it does come down to sort of what I term, kind of high school or sophomoric questions, which got us all into thinking, originally. That's why I've ended up doing research, going into physics and becoming an academic, because I wanted to know, the meaning of life when I was 14 or 15, and when I was 16 and read Kafka and got, and found someone that actually was dealing with those issues in a metaphorical way, that totally excited me. And then learning about mathematics and physics and realizing that, my God, this is one of the areas which actually does explain some things about the world around us, and seeing meaning in that. And that's why I do what I do. But I think that is exactly it, is that it comes down to these really almost simplistic, in a very positive sense, fundamental questions about life. And they have to be answered, at an individual level. But now, I think we're going to be forced into answering some of these questions at a collective level. I think that's becoming more and more critical. And, of course, people have done it the Greeks, after all, that was one of their big issues. And Karl Marx tried to answer it in a different way and so forth. People have tried to address these issues, but they haven't had what I consider the sword of Damocles hanging over them. That our head is going to be cut off soon.
Because?
Because of what? Because of our success. This is the great irony. The mechanisms that have brought us to this extraordinary place have built into them its own demise. That's my own view. And and it's just an incredible paradox. It's an amazing dilemma. I didn't say this earlier, my work on aging and mortality has a very similar characteristic, because if you ask, what is it that's killing you, so to speak, making you age and die, it is the dissipative forces, the forces of wear and tear, to put it in simple terms, arising out of metabolism, which is the very thing that's keeping you alive. The very thing that's keeping you alive is the thing that ultimately is going to end up killing you, whether you get disease or not. So there's a kind of analog in society, I think, or globally for us, that we need to start thinking about in really big, serious terms, much grander terms than we've been We focused on global warming, but it's just one piece of it. And that slightly disturbs me, actually. Obviously I'm tremendously supportive of all the research and the work on global warming and all the stuff about clean energy and all the other stuff. Absolutely, my God. But we shouldn't let that completely dominate the conversation of sustainability, which I'm afraid most times it does. It certainly is one of the more imminent dangers. But if the society does reach these critical points, social unrest will become greater and greater, for example. And there's going to be other kinds of economic woes. So we need to think of it in a much more systemic, holistic way. And that's the problem. To understand these things is extraordinarily challenging. And that's part of the issue we face. The world has speeded up so fast, this treadmill has speeded up so fast, that even people with the best of intentions that actually can form policy and make a difference have no time to absorb any of this. They want everything explained now in a tweet. Or at best in one page. And no doubt one can condense a lot of these things tremendously into things to give ideas. But this is a big issue. That's why I'm not very much an optimist. As I say, I hope I'm wrong. I hope this is all wrong, that somehow we'll always muddle through and that all will be fine. And we'll reach some marvelous new era, and we'll just keep growing, just keep growing, and things get better and better and faster and so on.